The candles in the great hall of Ashcombe Manor burned bright that evening, and every eye in the room turned toward the young maid who stood near the long table with a silver tray in her hands. Her name was Eliza Hartley, and she had worked at the manor for only 3 weeks. She did not know yet that tonight would be the night everything changed. The Duke of Ravensworth, a tall man named Edmund Ashford, sat at the head of the table. He wore a dark green coat and a gold ring on his smallest finger. His guests laughed at his every joke, and his voice carried across the room like thunder rolling over hills. He liked to be seen. He liked to be heard, and most of all, he liked to remind everyone below him exactly where they stood. Eliza moved quietly between the chairs, pouring wine, refilling plates, and staying out of the way. She had learned quickly that servants who drew attention to themselves often paid for it later. But on this night, the Duke's eyes found her anyway. "Ah," he said, lifting his glass toward her. "Our new girl. Tell me, child, do you know any language beyond the one your mother taught you in some village kitchen?" The table went quiet. A few of the guests smiled behind their napkins, sensing what was coming. Eliza kept her eyes down and said nothing. She had been warned about this. The housekeeper, a kind but tired woman named Mrs. Dawson, had told her on her very first day, "The Duke enjoys testing the servants. He speaks in Latin or French just to watch them squirm. Never answer. Never argue. Just nod and move on." So Eliza nodded, the way she had been taught, and reached for the empty plate beside the Duke's elbow. But he was not finished. "Vulgus profanum," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear, his eyes gleaming with amusement. He turned to his friend, Lord Sebastian Grey, who sat beside him with a smirk already forming. "It means the common crowd, the unlearned masses." He looked back at Eliza. "Do you understand a single word of that, girl?" A ripple of laughter moved down the table. Lady Beatrice Fenwick, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper words, covered her mouth with a lace glove, though her shoulders shook with quiet amusement. The Duke smiled, pleased with himself, the way a man smiles when he has proven something he already believed. Eliza felt her face grow warm, but she did not let it show. She simply curtsied, the way a proper maid should, and said, "No, Your Grace, I could not say." It was, in every way that mattered on the surface, a lie. Because Eliza Hartley understood Latin perfectly well. She had understood it since she was 9 years old, sitting on her father's knee in a small stone cottage far from this grand house, listening to him read from old books by candlelight. Her father, Charles Hartley, had once been a respected scholar, a man who taught young gentlemen at a fine school, before misfortune tore his life apart. He had taught his daughter everything he knew, not because he expected her to need it, but because he loved her, and because knowledge was the only treasure he had left to give her. That knowledge now lived quietly inside her, hidden the way a candle is hidden inside a closed lantern. She let no light escape. Not tonight. Not in front of these people. She finished serving the table and stepped back into the shadows near the wall, where the other servants stood waiting for their next task. Beside her stood Alice Turner, a girl a year older than Eliza, with red hair pulled tight beneath her cap, and a face that always seemed ready to laugh or cry, whichever came first. "You did well," Alice whispered. "Not everyone can take his jokes and keep a straight face." "It was not a joke to me," Eliza whispered back, though she kept her voice low enough that no one else could hear. Alice glanced at her sideways. "You understood him? What he said?" Eliza did not answer right away. She had already said too much, even in a whisper. "I understood enough," she finally said. "Enough to know he thinks very little of us." Alice shook her head slowly. "He thinks very little of everyone who was not born with his name. That is simply how it is here. Best not to give him a reason to notice you more than he already has." But it was too late for that. The Duke had noticed her. Not in the way Alice meant, not yet, but in a smaller way that would grow, slowly, like a seed pushed into dark soil, waiting for the right season to break through. Dinner continued for another hour. The guests talked of horses and politics and the newest fashions from London. The Duke told stories about his travels through Italy and France, dropping foreign phrases into his sentences, the way other men might drop sugar into tea, sweetening his words with the flavor of education that most in the room did not share. Every time he did this, he watched the servants' faces, searching for confusion, for blankness, for proof that he stood on a mountain, and they stood in the valley below. Eliza kept her expression calm through all of it. She had learned this skill the hard way, through years of practice, ever since her family's fortune had crumbled and she had been forced to trade her books for a broom. She had learned to swallow her pride the way one swallows medicine that tastes bitter but keeps the body alive. It had not always been this way. Before the manor, before the uniform and the long hours and the constant careful silence, Eliza had lived in a small house near the edge of a quiet town, where her father taught local boys their letters and their Latin verbs. He had once dreamed of sending Eliza to study further, perhaps even to correspond with scholars in London, for she had a mind quicker than any of his students, quicker even than some of the young men who later went on to attend fine universities. But dreams like that required money, and money required steady work, and steady work vanished the day her father fell ill and could no longer teach. He died 2 winters ago, leaving Eliza with nothing but his books, his memory, and a debt she could not pay. She sold the books first, one by one, keeping only a small worn copy of Latin poems that she hid at the bottom of her travel bag, wrapped in an old scarf so no one would question why a maid carried such a thing. Then she sold whatever else remained, and when there was nothing left to sell, she went looking for work, and work led her here, to Ashcombe Manor, to the household of a duke who mocked the very language her father had died proud to have taught her. She thought of her father often during nights like this one. She wondered what he would say if he could see her standing quietly against the wall, letting a wealthy man believe she understood nothing at all. She suspected he would tell her to be patient. He had always believed that truth had its own timing, that it revealed itself when it was ready, not a moment before. Eliza held on to that belief the way a sailor holds onto a rope during a storm. After the meal ended and the guests moved to the drawing room for cards and conversation, Eliza was sent to help clear the dining hall. She worked alongside Alice and an older servant named Mr. Whitfield, the butler, a stern man with graying hair and a voice that rarely rose above a murmur, yet somehow commanded instant obedience from every servant in the house. "You handled yourself well tonight," Mr. Whitfield said, as they stacked the last of the plates onto a cart. It was rare for him to offer praise, and Eliza looked up in surprise. "Thank you, sir. His Grace enjoys his little games," Whitfield continued, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on his work. "He has done this to every new servant since I came to this house 20 years ago. Some cry, some quit within the month. You did neither. That says something about your character." Eliza wanted to ask what exactly it said, but she held her tongue. Servants who asked too many questions were servants who did not last long in a house like this one. "Is he always so unkind?" she asked instead, choosing her words with care. Whitfield paused, considering his answer the way a man considers a chess move. Unkind is a strong word for what he does. I would call it distant. His Grace grew up in a house where affection was rare and expectation was constant. His father was a hard man, and his mother, though kind in her own way, believed that showing warmth to servants weakened the household structure. He learned early that keeping people at a distance kept him safe from disappointment. "That does not make his words hurt less," Eliza said quietly. "No," Whitfield agreed, "it does not. But understanding a man's wounds sometimes helps one bear his sharper edges." Eliza said nothing more, but she carried his words with her as she finished her duties that night, folding linens, sweeping the hallway, banking the fire in the smaller sitting room, before retiring to the small room she shared with Alice above the kitchen. That night, after Alice had fallen asleep, Eliza lay awake staring at the low wooden ceiling above her narrow bed. She thought about the Duke's words at dinner, the way he had smiled while trying to shame her, the way the guests had laughed along without a second thought for how it might feel to stand silent while your own intelligence is treated like a rumor no one believes. She thought, too, about her father, about the promise she had once made him without ever saying it aloud, that she would never let go of what he had taught her, no matter how far she fell, no matter how small her circumstances became. "Knowledge," he always said, "cannot be taken from you the way land or money can. It lives inside you. It waits." She closed her eyes and pictured him reading to her by candlelight, his voice steady and warm, the Latin words rolling off his tongue like music. She had always loved the sound of that language, the shape of it, The way old ideas could travel across centuries and still mean something to a girl sitting on a cottage floor. The Duke did not know what he carried in his own house. He did not know that the maid he mocked at dinner could recite verses he had never even attempted to memorize. He did not know that his careless words had landed on ears that understood every syllable. But he would find out. Not that night, not the next, but soon enough, in a moment neither of them could yet imagine. For now, Eliza kept her secret close, the way she had learned to keep everything close. Her grief, her pride, her past. She let the Duke believe what he wished to believe. She let the guests laugh. She let the candles burn low and the house grow quiet around her. Somewhere beneath the surface of her calm expression, something patient and unshaken was waiting. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something steadier than anger. It was the quiet certainty of a girl who knew her own worth, even when no one else in the room did. The next morning came early, as it always did at Ashcombe Manor. The sun had barely touched the tops of the trees when Eliza rose from her narrow bed, dressed in her gray uniform, and made her way down to the kitchen to begin her duties. The cook, a broad woman named Mrs. Colby, was already at work, her arms covered in flour, shouting instructions to a young kitchen boy who could not seem to move fast enough for her liking. "There you are," Mrs. Colby said when she spotted Eliza. "His Grace wants the library dusted before noon. Seems he has guests coming again this evening. More important than last night's crowd, if you can believe it. Go on, quick now." Eliza nodded and gathered her cleaning supplies. She did not mind the task. In fact, she looked forward to it more than any other chore in the house, though she was careful never to let that show. The library at Ashcombe Manor held more books than she had seen anywhere since her father's collection had been sold away. Shelves upon shelves reaching toward a high ceiling, painted with faded images of clouds and stars. She entered the room quietly, her cloth and polish in hand, and stopped for a moment simply to look. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching dust in the air like tiny floating stars. The smell of old paper and leather bindings filled her lungs, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to belong in a room like this, rather than simply clean it. She ran her cloth along the lower shelves first, careful not to disturb the arrangement of the books, though her eyes could not help but drift across their spines. Histories, philosophy, poetry, in 3 different languages. A collection of maps so old, the ink had faded to the color of weak tea. She recognized several titles from her father's old collection, and her chest tightened with a feeling she could not quite name, somewhere between comfort and loss. She was so absorbed in her quiet study of the shelves that she did not hear the door open behind her. "You seem very interested in books, for someone whose job is only to dust them." Eliza spun around, her heart lurching, to find the Duke standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, one eyebrow raised in curiosity rather than anger. She had not expected him to be awake this early, let alone standing in his own library watching her. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, lowering her eyes and returning her attention to the shelf in front of her. "I did not mean to linger." "I did not say you were doing anything wrong," he replied, stepping further into the room. "I simply observed that you were looking at the titles rather than simply wiping them clean." "A curious mind is easily distracted, Your Grace," she said carefully. "I meant no disrespect." He studied her for a long moment, the way one studies a puzzle, whose pieces do not quite fit the picture on the box. "You are an unusual servant, Miss Hartley." She said nothing, unsure whether this was meant as a compliment or a warning. "Most girls your age would rather be anywhere but a room full of dusty old pages," he continued. "Yet you move through this library as though you are searching for something specific." "I am only doing my work, sir," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if he could hear the small crack of untruth hiding beneath them. The Duke walked slowly along the shelves, running one finger across the spines, the way a man might trail his hand along a garden fence, thinking of something else entirely. "My father built this collection," he said, almost to himself. "He believed a great house should have a great library, whether or not anyone in the family actually read the books inside it." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "I confess I have read perhaps 1/10 of what stands on these shelves." Eliza kept polishing, unsure why he was telling her this, unsure whether she was meant to respond at all. "Tell me," he said suddenly, turning to face her fully. "Do you read, Miss Hartley?" The question hung in the air like a held breath. Eliza's hands stilled on the shelf in front of her. She thought of the small book of Latin poems, hidden at the bottom of her trunk upstairs, wrapped carefully in an old scarf. She thought of her father's voice, patient and warm, teaching her letters before she could even walk steadily on her own 2 feet. "A little, Your Grace," she said finally, choosing the safest possible answer, one that was true enough not to be a lie, yet small enough not to invite further questions. Simple things, a prayer book, nothing of importance. The Duke studied her a moment longer, and for a heartbeat, Eliza feared he could see straight through her carefully built wall, the way sunlight sometimes passes through a curtain that appears thick until the light behind it grows strong enough. But then he simply nodded, seemingly satisfied, and turned toward the window. "See that the room is ready before noon," he said, his voice returning to its usual cool distance. "I have important guests arriving this evening, and I intend for this library to be part of the evening's entertainment." "Yes, Your Grace," Eliza said, relief loosening the tightness in her chest. He left the room without another word, his footsteps echoing down the hallway, and Eliza let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. She pressed her palm flat against the cool wood of the bookshelf and closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. That had been close, closer than she liked. She finished dusting the library in silence, her mind turning over the strange exchange again and again. There had been something different in the way the Duke looked at her this morning, something less certain than the confident cruelty he had shown at dinner the night before. It was as though a small crack had opened in his usual armor, just wide enough for a sliver of genuine curiosity to slip through. She told herself it meant nothing. Noblemen were curious about many things, the way a child is curious about a locked box, not because they care what is inside, but because the mystery itself is entertaining. She would do well to remember that, and guard herself accordingly. And yet, as she carried her cleaning supplies back down to the kitchen, she found herself replaying his words. "You are an unusual servant, Miss Hartley. Do you read, Miss Hartley?" There had been something almost gentle in the way he said her name, a softness she had not expected from a man who had mocked her so easily just hours before. She pushed the thought aside as best she could. Whatever softness he showed in private moments meant little if he continued his public games, and something told her, deep in her bones, that tonight's gathering of important guests would bring exactly that kind of display once again. She was right to worry. By the time evening arrived, the manor had transformed once more into a stage for the Duke's performance. Carriages rolled up the long drive, delivering guests dressed in silks and jewels that glittered under the candlelight. Eliza and Alice worked side by side in the kitchen, preparing trays, arranging place settings, and rehearsing in their minds the careful blankness required to survive an evening in the Duke's dining hall.
"Lord Sebastian is coming again,"
Alice whispered as they carried trays toward the hall.
"and Lady Beatrice."
"And I hear the Duke's own mother will be present tonight as well." Eliza's stomach tightened at the mention of the Duchess. She had not yet met the woman who had raised the Duke, but from what little the other servants said, she was every bit as sharp-tongued as her son, though perhaps with a colder patience beneath her words, rather than his open amusement. The dinner began much as the previous one had, with polite conversation and careful courses served in perfect order. Eliza kept her eyes low, her movements precise, determined not to draw the Duke's attention the way she had unintentionally done the day before in the library. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Partway through the meal, as the guests discussed a recent gathering in London, the Duke turned his attention once again toward the servants standing along the wall, his eyes eventually landing on Eliza. "Ah, Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying easily across the table, "perhaps you can settle a small disagreement for us." Eliza's heart dropped, but she stepped forward as required, keeping her expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace?" "Lord Sebastian believes that no servant in this house could recognize a single line of classical poetry if it were read aloud to them," the Duke said, a familiar gleam of mischief returning to his eyes. "I told him such assumptions are unfair, though I confess I have little proof to offer otherwise." Lord Sebastian smirked from his seat, clearly enjoying the game already forming. "It is not an unfair assumption, Ashford, merely an honest one. Servants are not paid to read poetry. They are paid to serve it, in the form of wine and bread." A few guests chuckled at this, though the Duchess, seated near the head of the table, said nothing, her expression unreadable as she watched the exchange unfold with sharp, careful eyes. Well then, the Duke said, turning back to Eliza. Let us test the theory properly. He reached for a small leather book resting near his plate, one Eliza had not noticed before, and opened it to a marked page. Tell me, Miss Hartley, does this line mean anything to you at all? He began to read aloud, his voice smooth and confident, reciting a line of Latin verse meant to describe the fleeting nature of youth and beauty. It was a common enough line, one Eliza recognized instantly from a poem her father had taught her many years ago, one of the very first verses she had ever memorized, as a small girl sitting at his knee. The Duke finished reading and looked at her expectantly, clearly certain of the blank stare he was about to receive, certain of the laughter that would follow, certain of the small victory he believed was already his. Eliza opened her mouth to give her usual careful answer, the safe words that would protect her secret and keep her position secure. But something in her hesitated. She thought of her father's voice, of his patient pride whenever she recited a verse correctly, of the promise she had made to herself never to let go of what he had given her, no matter how deeply she buried it beneath the surface of her daily life. She thought, too, of the small crack she had seen in the Duke that morning in the library, the flicker of genuine curiosity behind his usual mask of cool amusement. And in that moment, standing before the entire table, Eliza Hartley made a decision that would change everything that followed. She did not yet know it, but the Duke of Ravensworth was about to learn something about his quiet, simple maid that would shake the very foundation of everything he believed about the world and the people who served him within it. The candles flickered, the room waited. And Eliza, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Manor, allowed a small, careful truth to rise to the surface. Eliza lifted her chin slightly, keeping her voice soft and steady. It speaks of youth passing quickly, Your Grace, like a flower that blooms in the morning and fades before the evening comes. For a moment, nobody at the table moved. Lord Sebastian's smirk faltered. Lady Beatrice's fan stopped halfway through its slow wave. Even the clatter of forks against fine china seemed to pause, as though the whole room had taken a single held breath. The Duke stared at her, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and something else he could not yet name. You understood that? I understood the meaning, Your Grace, Eliza said carefully. Not every word, perhaps, but enough to know its message. It was a small lie wrapped around a larger truth, and she offered it the way a person offers a coin, with a hidden crease, hoping no one looks too closely at the metal beneath. She had understood every single word. She could have recited the following 3 lines without pause. But she had learned long ago that showing too much of oneself in a room full of strangers was its own kind of danger. The Duke set down his book slowly, his eyes never leaving her face. How does a kitchen maid come to understand fragments of classical verse? My father taught me a little, sir, when I was young, Eliza answered, choosing her words as carefully as a woman crossing a frozen pond, testing each step before trusting her full weight to it. He believed everyone should know a few beautiful things, even if their life held little room for beauty afterward. Lord Sebastian let out a short laugh, though it lacked its earlier confidence. A remarkable coincidence that a servant girl happens to recall the one line His Grace chose to read. Perhaps it is simply a common line, my lord, Eliza replied, keeping her tone humble, even as her words carried quiet steadiness. Many old verses speak of youth and time. It would not take great learning to guess its meaning from tone alone. It was a clever answer, one that offered an escape route for everyone at the table, including herself. The Duke could choose to believe she had guessed cleverly, rather than understood fully, and in believing that, he could preserve the shape of the world as he had always known it. A world where servants stood apart from scholars, where labor and learning lived in separate houses. For a long moment he studied her, and Eliza forced herself to meet his gaze evenly, neither defiant nor afraid, simply calm, the way still water sits calm, even when a stone has just broken its surface. Finally, the Duke gave a short laugh of his own, waving a dismissive hand as though brushing away a fly. Well, there you have it, Sebastian. Even the servants in this house possess more wit than you gave them credit for. Perhaps you owe Miss Hartley an apology. The table laughed again, though this time the laughter felt different, uncertain, unsure exactly what had happened, or what it meant. Lord Sebastian muttered something about servants and lucky guesses, and the conversation soon moved on to other matters. The incident folded away, as though it had been nothing more than a passing curiosity. But Eliza noticed the Duchess watching her long after the others had lost interest. The older woman's eyes were sharp and assessing, the kind of gaze that missed very little and forgot even less. Eliza curtsied and stepped back into the shadows along the wall, her heart pounding harder than she let her face reveal. She had come far too close tonight. She knew it, and she suspected the Duchess knew it too. Later that evening, once the guests had retired to the drawing room and the servants had begun clearing the last of the dishes, Alice pulled Eliza aside in the narrow hallway leading toward the kitchen. "What were you thinking?" Alice whispered, her eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and fear. "Answering him like that, in front of everyone?" "I do not know," Eliza admitted quietly. "The words simply came before I could stop them." "You must be more careful," Alice said, glancing over her shoulder to be certain no one else could hear. "His Grace enjoys clever answers when they amuse him, but he does not enjoy being outdone, especially not by someone he considers beneath him. If he ever begins to feel foolish rather than entertained, his mood could turn quickly, and not in your favor." Eliza knew Alice spoke from experience, though neither of them said so aloud. Every servant at Ashcombe Manor carried stories of the Duke's sharper moods, the way his charm could turn cold in an instant if he felt his authority questioned. He was not a cruel man in the way some noblemen were cruel, not given to shouting or striking those beneath him. His cruelty lived in smaller, quieter places, a dismissive word, a public correction, a joke made at another's expense simply because he could. "I will be more careful," Eliza promised, though even as she said the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them herself. That night, after the household had finally quieted, and the last candle in the servants' quarters had been extinguished, Eliza found she could not sleep. Her mind kept returning to the moment at dinner, to the way the Duke had looked at her, not with anger, but with something closer to curiosity, the same look she had noticed earlier that morning in the library. She rose quietly from her narrow bed, careful not to wake Alice, and made her way down the darkened hallway toward the library. She told herself she only wished to be certain the room had been properly closed up for the night, that no candles had been left burning near the curtains, a duty any careful servant might check without suspicion. But in truth, she simply wanted to be near the books again, if only for a few stolen minutes. The manor at night felt like an entirely different place, its usual grandeur softened into shadow and silence. Eliza moved carefully down the stairs, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floor, until she reached the tall library doors. She slipped inside, closing the door gently behind her, and stood for a moment simply breathing in the familiar scent of old paper and leather. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows, casting long silver shapes across the floor. Eliza moved toward the nearest shelf and let her fingers trail along the spines, the same way the Duke had done that morning, though for entirely different reasons. She was not searching for treasure or history. She was searching for comfort, for a small taste of the world her father had once opened for her, before poverty had closed so many doors. She found a familiar title near the end of one shelf, a collection of classical poems bound in cracked brown leather, and pulled it carefully from its place. She carried it to the window, where the moonlight was strongest, and sat down on the low cushioned bench beneath the glass, opening the book gently across her knees. The words on the page felt like old friends returning after a long absence. She read slowly, mouthing the familiar Latin phrases under her breath, allowing herself, for just a few stolen minutes, to be exactly who she truly was, rather than who her circumstances required her to pretend to be. She did not hear the door open. "I did not expect to find anyone here at this hour." Eliza startled so badly she nearly dropped the book from her lap. She looked up to find the Duke standing in the doorway, dressed in a simple dark robe over his evening clothes, a single candle held in one hand, its flame casting flickering shadows across his face. "Your Grace," she stammered, scrambling to her feet, the book still clutched in her hands. "Forgive me, I only meant to check that the room was properly closed for the night, and I—" Her words faltered as his eyes moved from her face, the book she held, then back again, his expression shifting slowly from surprise into something far more difficult to read. "That is not a room-checking duty," he said quietly, stepping further into the library, closing the door softly behind him. "That is a book in your hands, Miss Hartley. An open book, read by moonlight no less." Eliza's mind raced, searching desperately for an explanation that might satisfy him, some careful lie that would smooth over the moment and allow her to escape back to the safety of her narrow bed upstairs. But looking at his face, at the quiet intensity in his eyes, she understood, perhaps for the first time, that no clever answer would save her tonight. The moment stretched between them, silent and heavy, the candlelight trembling gently between two people who had, until this very instant, existed in entirely separate worlds within the very same house. "Well," the Duke said finally, setting his candle down upon a nearby table, his voice low and careful, as though he were approaching a wild creature he did not wish to startle away. "It seems, Miss Hartley, that you and I have a great deal to discuss." Eliza swallowed hard, clutching the old book tightly against her chest, and understood, with a strange mixture of fear and something almost like relief, that the careful wall she had built around herself for so long had finally begun to crack. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The candle between them flickered, throwing soft light across the shelves, and Eliza felt the weight of the silence pressing against her chest like a stone. "Please, Your Grace," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I meant no disrespect. I only wished to read for a few moments, before returning to my quarters. I will not do it again." "That is not what troubles me," the Duke said, moving slowly toward the window, where she had been sitting only moments before. He glanced down at the cushioned bench, then back at her. "What troubles me is that you have been hiding something from me since the moment you arrived in this house." Eliza's heart pounded so hard, she feared he might hear it across the quiet room. "I do not understand your meaning, sir." "I think you do," he said, and though his voice remained calm, there was no longer any trace of his usual cool amusement. "You understood every word of that verse I read at dinner tonight. Not merely its meaning, but its exact wording. I watched your face when I read it. You did not guess. You remembered." Eliza opened her mouth to protest, some careful denial already forming on her tongue. But something in the Duke's steady gaze stopped her. He was not looking at her the way he looked at his guests during dinner, searching for weakness to exploit. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a locked door he has finally realized was never meant to keep him out, only to keep something valuable safe within. "My father was a teacher," she said finally, the words coming slowly, as though each one cost her something precious to release. "He taught young gentlemen their letters and their languages in a small town far from here. He believed knowledge should belong to everyone, not simply those born into wealth. He taught me alongside his students, though he never told anyone outside our home that he did so." The Duke listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable in the flickering candlelight. "When he grew ill," Eliza continued, "his work ended, and so did our income. We had little saved, and what we had went quickly toward medicine and doctors who could not save him in the end. When he died, I was left with nothing but his books, and even those I was forced to sell, piece by piece, simply to survive the winter that followed. And so you came here," the Duke said quietly, "carrying an education most noblemen's daughters never receive, hidden beneath a servant's uniform." "Yes, Your Grace," Eliza said, meeting his eyes at last. "I did not think it wise to announce such a thing to a household that hires maids to serve wine, not to discuss poetry. I feared it would only bring trouble, not opportunity." The Duke was quiet for a long moment, turning her words over in his mind the way one turns a coin to examine both its faces. "You feared correctly," he said eventually. "Most households would see it as trouble. A servant who reads Latin better than half the gentlemen who dine at my table is not a comfortable thought for many of my peers." "Then you understand why I kept it hidden," Eliza said softly. "I understand why you believed you needed to," he replied. "Whether that belief was entirely correct is another matter." Eliza did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, simply standing quietly beneath the moonlight with the old book still held against her chest like a shield. The Duke studied her for a long moment, then walked slowly toward the shelf nearest him, running his fingers along the spines the way he had done that morning. "Tell me something, Miss Hartley. When I mocked you at dinner last night, speaking Latin simply to embarrass you in front of my guests, what did you feel?" The question caught her by surprise, and for a moment, she considered offering a safe, polite answer, the kind a servant gives when asked an uncomfortable question by someone who holds power over her future. But something about the quiet library, the late hour, and the unusual honesty, already exchanged between them, made her choose differently. "I felt ashamed, Your Grace," she said honestly, "not because I did not understand your words, but because I did. and I could say nothing without risking everything I had left. I felt as though the one thing my father gave me, the one thing poverty could not take away, had been turned into a joke for the amusement of people who would never think to ask whether the maid pouring their wine might understand every word they said about her. The Duke's expression shifted at her words, something flickering behind his eyes that Eliza could not quite name. Guilt, perhaps, or something closer to recognition, as though her words had struck a place inside him he did not often allow others to see. "I did not think of it that way," he admitted quietly, and there was an honesty in his voice Eliza had not expected from him. "Most who hold power rarely do, Your Grace," she said, then immediately regretted the boldness of her words, fearing she had finally pushed too far. But the Duke did not grow angry. Instead, he simply nodded slowly, his gaze drifting toward the window and the dark gardens beyond. "My father believed that showing weakness of any kind, including kindness, was a danger to a house like this one. He taught me that servants respected distance more than warmth, that familiarity bred disrespect. I have carried that belief since I was a boy, without ever truly questioning whether it was correct." "And do you believe it now, Your Grace?" Eliza asked softly. He turned back to face her, and for a long moment, silence stretched between them once again, filled with something neither of them yet had words for. "I am no longer certain what I believe," he said finally. "But I find myself curious to learn more, Miss Hartley, if you would permit it." Eliza blinked, uncertain she had heard him correctly. "Permit what, Your Grace?" "Conversation," he said simply, "away from the dinner table, away from the eyes of my guests. I find I have very few people in this house, or indeed in my life, who speak to me honestly, rather than simply telling me what they believe I wish to hear. Tonight, for the first time in longer than I care to admit, someone spoke to me plainly, and I find I did not dislike it nearly as much as I expected to." Eliza did not know how to answer such an offer, torn between the danger it clearly carried and the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had begun to loosen the tightness in her chest. "Your Grace, I am only a servant in this house. It would not be proper for—" "Propriety," the Duke interrupted gently, "has kept this house quiet and cold for longer than I care to remember. I am not asking you to abandon your position, Miss Hartley, nor am I asking anything improper of you. I am simply asking for honest conversation now and then, when the household is quiet and no one else need know of it." Eliza hesitated, weighing the offer carefully. She thought of Alice's warning, of the danger such attention could bring, of the whispers that would surely follow if anyone discovered the Duke sought out a servant girl for late-night conversation in his library. But she also thought of her father, of the years spent hiding the very thing that made her who she truly was, and she felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Manor, a small flicker of hope that perhaps she would not need to hide forever. "I would not wish to cause trouble for either of us, Your Grace," she said carefully. "Then we shall be careful," the Duke replied, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth for the first time that evening, softer and more genuine than any expression she had yet seen from him. "Return to your quarters now, Miss Hartley, before the household wakes and wonders where you have gone. But know that this library door is not locked to you, should you wish to return." Eliza curtsied quietly, still uncertain what exactly had just occurred between them, and made her way toward the door. Just before she stepped into the darkened hallway, she paused and looked back at him. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly, "for listening." He said nothing in reply, simply watching her go, the candle flickering low beside him, casting long shadows across the towering shelves of books that had, until tonight, kept their secrets as carefully as she had kept her own. Eliza returned to her narrow bed just as the first hint of gray light began to touch the horizon outside her window. She lay awake for a long while, staring at the low ceiling above her, turning the evening's events over and over in her mind. She did not know what would come of the Duke's strange offer, whether it would lead to friendship, to danger, or simply to nothing at all. Once morning light burned away the honesty of midnight conversation. But for the first time since her father's death, Eliza felt something she had almost forgotten the shape of, the small, fragile beginning of hope. She did not yet know how carefully that hope would need to be guarded in the days ahead, nor how many watchful eyes within Ashcombe Manor had already begun to notice the quiet, unusual attention the Duke had started paying to his simple maid. In the days that followed, Small changes began to take root at Ashcombe Manor, changes so quiet that only the most watchful eyes noticed them at first. The Duke no longer spoke to Eliza with the same careless mockery he once used so freely. When she entered a room to serve or clean, his eyes would sometimes follow her a moment longer than necessary, though he was careful never to let his gaze linger long enough to draw attention from his guests or his household. Their conversations became a quiet ritual, held only in the late hours when the rest of the manor had fallen asleep. Eliza would slip down to the library once or twice a week, always careful to check the hallways first, always ready with an excuse should anyone question her presence there. More often than not, the Duke was already waiting, a single candle burning low on the table beside him, a book open in his lap that he had clearly not been reading, his attention fixed instead on the doorway, watching for her arrival. Their discussions ranged widely across many subjects. Sometimes they spoke of poetry, comparing the verses Eliza's father had taught her against the more famous works the Duke had studied during his own education. Other times they spoke of history, of philosophy, of the strange and complicated nature of a world that divided people so sharply by birth, rather than by merit or character. "You speak of these ideas as though you have thought deeply about them for years," the Duke said one evening, leaning back in his chair as Eliza sat across from him near the low-burning fire. "Most young women I have met, even those born to wealth and position, rarely discuss such matters with any real conviction." "Perhaps they have simply never been given the chance to think about them at all," Eliza replied. "It is easy to appear uninterested in ideas when no one has ever asked for your opinion on them." The Duke considered this for a long moment, turning his glass slowly in his hand. "You make a fair point, Miss Hartley. I confess I have spent very little time considering what opinions the women in my life might hold, beyond whether they approve of my choice in waistcoats." Eliza allowed herself a small smile at this, the first genuine amusement she had shown in his presence since her arrival at the manor. "Perhaps that is a mistake worth correcting, Your Grace." "Perhaps it is," he agreed, and for a moment, the space between them felt lighter than it had any right to feel, given the vast difference in their stations. But not everyone within the household remained unaware of these late-night meetings. Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, had grown suspicious after noticing Eliza's exhaustion during her morning duties, the way she sometimes struggled to stifle a yawn while dusting the front hall or folding linens in the laundry room. She said nothing directly, but her eyes followed Eliza with a careful, questioning attention that made the young maid uneasy. Alice, too, had begun to notice the change, though she remained Eliza's closest confidant within the household. "You look tired again," she said one morning, as they prepared breakfast trays together in the kitchen. "Where do you go at night, Eliza? I have woken more than once to find your bed empty." Eliza hesitated, torn between her loyalty to Alice's friendship and the danger of revealing too much. "I have trouble sleeping sometimes," she said carefully. "I walk the halls when my mind will not settle." Alice studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but she did not press further. "Be careful, whatever you are doing," she said instead, lowering her voice, even though no one else stood near enough to hear. "This house has many eyes, Eliza, and not all of them wish you well." Eliza took the warning to heart, though she found herself unable to stop the late-night visits to the library entirely. There was something in those quiet hours with the Duke that she had not realized she was missing until she found it again. The simple pleasure of being truly heard, of having her thoughts taken seriously, rather than dismissed because of the uniform she wore during daylight hours. The Duke, too, seemed to change in small ways that others within the household began to notice, even if they could not yet explain why. He grew less inclined to mock his servants during dinner parties, choosing instead to redirect conversation when his guests attempted their usual cruel jokes at the expense of those who served them. Lord Sebastian noticed this shift first, and being a man who valued his own amusement above nearly everything else, he did not take kindly to losing his favorite source of entertainment. "You have grown soft, Ashford," he said one evening, as the two men sat together in the drawing room following dinner, brandy glasses in hand. "You used to enjoy these little games as much as I did. Now, you scold me for simply asking your maid a harmless question about her education." "Perhaps I have simply grown tired of games that serve no purpose beyond making myself feel superior to people who have no means of defending themselves," the Duke replied, his tone carefully neutral. though something in his expression suggested the conversation had touched a nerve he had not expected. Lord Sebastian raised an eyebrow, studying his friend with new interest. "This is unlike you, Edmund. Has something changed?" "Nothing has changed," the Duke said quickly, perhaps too quickly, and Lord Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly with the particular curiosity of a man who has just discovered a thread worth pulling. It was Lady Beatrice Fenwick, however, who first voiced her suspicions aloud, though she did so carefully, choosing her words the way a hunter chooses a trap, designed to spring only when the right prey wandered close enough. "I have noticed," she said, one afternoon during a visit to the manor, her voice pitched, just loud enough for the nearby servants to hear as they arranged tea in the sitting room, "that His Grace seems rather less inclined to enjoy his usual entertainments these days. One almost wonders if some new distraction has captured his attention instead." She glanced meaningfully toward Eliza, who stood near the tea cart, keeping her eyes carefully lowered, her hands steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. "Whatever do you mean, Beatrice?" asked another guest, oblivious to the sharper meaning hidden beneath the woman's words. "Oh, nothing in particular," Lady Beatrice said lightly, though her gaze lingered on Eliza a moment longer before returning to her tea. "Simply an observation. One does notice these small changes in a household one visits often." Eliza kept her composure through the remainder of the visit, though her hands trembled slightly as she cleared the tea service afterward. She understood, with growing unease, that whatever quiet understanding had begun to grow between herself and the Duke was no longer as invisible as she had hoped it might remain. That evening, when she slipped down to the library as usual, she found the Duke already waiting, though his expression carried none of its usual warmth. Instead, he looked troubled, his brow furrowed as he stared into the low flames of the fireplace. "Lady Beatrice has noticed a change in me," he said, without preamble, before Eliza had even fully closed the door behind her. She was careful with her words, but I understood her meaning well enough. She suspects something, though she does not yet know what. Eliza's heart sank at his words, though she tried to keep her voice steady. "What would you have me do, Your Grace?" The Duke was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the fire rather than on her. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "I find I do not wish to stop our conversations, and yet I understand the danger they pose, both to your position in this house and to my own reputation among my peers. Perhaps it would be wiser to end them," Eliza said softly, though the words cost her more than she expected them to, "before Lady Beatrice's suspicions grow into something neither of us can control." The Duke looked up at her then, and something in his expression made her breath catch unexpectedly in her throat. "Is that truly what you wish, Miss Hartley?" Eliza hesitated, torn between the safety of caution and the strange, unfamiliar warmth that had grown between them over these past weeks. "It is not what I wish, Your Grace," she admitted quietly, "but it may be what is wisest for both of us." The Duke rose slowly from his chair and moved toward the window, his hands clasped behind his back as he stared out into the darkened gardens beyond. "I have spent my entire life doing what was considered wise, Miss Hartley. Marrying wisely, speaking wisely, choosing my friendships and my amusements according to what my position required of me. I confess I have grown rather tired of wisdom, if it means abandoning the one honest conversation I have found within these walls." Eliza did not know how to respond to such an admission, so she said nothing, simply standing quietly near the door as the fire crackled softly between them. "We will be more careful," the Duke said finally, turning back to face her. "I will find ways to explain our meetings that satisfy curious minds without revealing the truth of what we discuss here. But I am not yet ready to let this end, Miss Hartley, whatever the risk may be." Eliza felt a strange mixture of relief and fear settle over her at his words, understanding, perhaps for the first time, just how deeply this quiet friendship had already rooted itself within her heart, and how much danger that rooting now carried for them both. Neither of them could have known, standing together in the flickering firelight of the library that evening, just how quickly the careful walls around their secret would soon begin to crumble, nor how public the coming reckoning would ultimately become. The Duchess of Ravensworth had not built her reputation as one of the sharpest minds in London society by ignoring the small details others so often overlooked. Margaret Ashford had spent decades reading rooms the way other women read novels, noticing the subtle shift of a glance, the careful pause before a sentence, the way a person's shoulders relaxed or tightened depending on who stood nearby. She had noticed, over the past several weeks, that her son's shoulders relaxed in a very particular way whenever a certain quiet maid entered the room. She said nothing at first, choosing instead to watch and wait, the way a careful gardener watches a strange new growth, before deciding whether to nurture it or pull it from the soil entirely. But when Lady Beatrice mentioned her own observations during a private visit, the Duchess understood that whatever was happening beneath her roof had already grown too large to remain unnoticed by outside eyes. She summoned her son to her private sitting room one afternoon, a place he rarely visited unless required to discuss matters of family business or estate management. He arrived expecting talk of finances or perhaps an upcoming social obligation, and was instead met with a look from his mother that told him immediately this conversation would be neither of those things. "Sit, Edmund," she said, gesturing toward the chair across from her own. "We have something to discuss." The Duke sat, keeping his expression carefully neutral, though something in his mother's tone already told him what subject she intended to raise. "What troubles you, mother?" "Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you do not already know," she said, her voice calm, but edged with the particular sharpness she reserved for matters she considered serious. "I have heard whispers, Edmund. Whispers about late nights in the library, about a certain maid who seems to occupy far more of your attention than any servant reasonably should." The Duke's jaw tightened slightly, though he kept his voice steady. "I do not see how my private conversations concern anyone beyond myself." "They concern everyone in this house, the moment others begin to notice them," the Duchess replied sharply. "You are the Duke of Ravensworth, Edmund. Your reputation is not simply your own possession. It belongs to this family, to this estate, to every servant and tenant whose livelihood depends upon the stability of this household's good name. If word spreads that you have taken a private interest in a maid, however innocent that interest may be, the damage to your reputation, and to hers, will be considerable and difficult to undo. Her name is Eliza Hartley," the Duke said quietly, "and she is not simply some ordinary maid, mother. She is remarkably educated, thoughtful, and honest, in ways I have found nowhere else in this house, least of all among the guests who dine at my table each week." The Duchess studied her son carefully, her expression softening slightly, though her concern did not fade entirely. "I do not doubt her qualities, Edmund, but qualities alone do not change the world we live in, nor the expectations placed upon a man in your position. What do you intend to do with this interest of yours? Elevate a servant girl to a place society will never accept her in? Or continue these secret meetings until the scandal becomes impossible to contain?" The Duke had no ready answer, and his silence told his mother more than any words could have. "I will not forbid you from speaking with her," the Duchess said finally, rising from her chair and moving toward the window. "I am not so cruel as to demand you treat every servant in this house with the same coldness your father once demanded of me, but I ask you to consider carefully what you are building, Edmund, before it grows into something neither of you can control, and before it costs that young woman far more than it costs you." Her words settled heavily in the Duke's mind long after he left her sitting room, and that evening, he found himself unable to shake the weight of her warning, even as he made his way once again toward the library where Eliza waited. He found her already seated near the fire, a book open in her lap, though her eyes lifted the moment he entered, reading his troubled expression immediately. "Something is wrong," she said, setting the book aside, as he sat down across from her. "My mother has noticed our meetings," he admitted, deciding honesty served them both better than pretense. "She has asked me to consider carefully what I intend by continuing them." Eliza's expression grew guarded, though she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "She is not wrong to worry," the Duke said, running a hand through his hair, a rare gesture of frustration from a man who usually guarded his composure so carefully. "Society will not easily accept a friendship between a duke and his maid, whatever its true nature. If word spreads further, the consequences will fall heaviest upon you, Miss Hartley, not upon me. I have position enough to weather scandal, you do not." "I am aware of that, Your Grace," Eliza said quietly. "I have been aware of it since the very first evening you invited me to speak with you honestly." "Then perhaps we should end these meetings," the Duke said, though the words clearly cost him something to say aloud. Eliza was quiet for a long moment, staring into the low flames of the fire. "Is that truly what you believe is right, or simply what caution demands?" The Duke did not answer immediately, and in his silence, Eliza found the answer she needed. "I do not wish to end these conversations either, Your Grace," she said softly. "But I fear caution may no longer be enough to protect either of us, whatever we decide." Her words proved more prophetic than either of them could have known that evening. 2 days later, during a formal gathering held to celebrate the upcoming marriage of a distant cousin, Lord Sebastian arrived with a plan already formed in his mind. He had spent the past several days quietly gathering information from servants willing to trade small confidences for small coins, piecing together enough fragments to feel confident in the suspicion he now carried. He intended to use tonight's gathering to test that suspicion publicly, in a manner designed to either confirm his theory or embarrass the Duke enough to discourage whatever strange attachment had formed within his household. The evening began much as any other, with polite conversation and careful courses served in perfect order. Eliza moved among the guests as she always did, serving quietly, keeping her eyes low, unaware of the trap Lord Sebastian had spent days preparing. Partway through the meal, as conversation turned once again toward matters of education and refinement among the lower classes, Lord Sebastian raised his glass with a knowing smile, directed toward the Duke. "Ashford," he said, his voice carrying easily across the table, "I recall an evening not long ago, when your maid here proved surprisingly capable of understanding a line of classical verse. I wonder, given her apparent talents, whether she might be willing to demonstrate them further tonight, for the benefit of our guests who missed that particular display." The Duke's expression tightened, recognizing immediately the trap being laid before him, though he could not yet see its full shape. "I do not think that is necessary, Sebastian." "Nonsense," Lord Sebastian replied smoothly, his eyes glittering with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has already won. "Surely a talent so remarkable deserves a proper audience. Miss Hartley, would you indulge us?" Every eye at the table turned toward Eliza, who stood frozen near the wall, uncertain how to navigate the sudden, dangerous attention, now focused entirely upon her. She looked toward the Duke, searching his face for guidance, and found there an expression of quiet, helpless concern that told her, more clearly than any words could have, that whatever happened next would carry consequences neither of them could fully predict. Eliza felt every eye at the table pressing against her like a physical weight. She glanced once more toward the Duke, whose jaw was tight with barely contained frustration, though he said nothing further, understanding perhaps that any attempt to protect her now would only confirm Lord Sebastian's suspicions more completely than silence ever could. "I would not wish to bore your guests, my lord," Eliza said carefully, offering the safest response she could manage under the circumstances. "I am only a servant, and my understanding of such matters is quite limited." "Limited enough to correctly interpret a line of Virgil without hesitation, as I recall," Lord Sebastian replied smoothly, clearly enjoying the discomfort his words were causing. "Come now, Miss Hartley, there is no shame in a hidden talent. Quite the opposite. I simply wish to understand it better." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small folded paper, one Eliza suspected he had prepared well before arriving that evening. "I have taken the liberty of preparing a short passage," he said, unfolding it slowly, savoring the tension building around the table. "Nothing overly difficult. Simply enough to satisfy my curiosity, and perhaps the curiosity of our other guests as well." He began to read aloud, his pronunciation careful but slightly imperfect, the way a man reads something he has memorized for effect rather than something he truly understands. The passage was longer and more complex than the simple line the Duke had read weeks earlier, chosen deliberately, Eliza suspected, to either expose her knowledge fully or force her into an obvious, humiliating denial. When he finished, he looked at her expectantly, along with every other guest at the table, waiting for her response. Eliza's mind raced through her options. She could claim complete ignorance, denying any understanding at all, though she suspected few at the table would believe such a claim after her earlier slip. She could offer another careful, partial answer, vague enough to protect her secret, while still satisfying the room's curiosity. Or she could finally allow the truth to surface completely, accepting whatever consequences followed. She thought of her father, of the quiet pride in his voice whenever she recited a difficult passage correctly. She thought of the Duchess's warning, of the danger such visibility could bring. She thought too of the Duke, watching her now with an expression caught somewhere between fear and something that looked almost like faith. as though he trusted her to find her own way through this moment without his interference. "The passage speaks of a storm at sea, my lord," Eliza said finally, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart, "and of sailors who must choose between abandoning their cargo to survive the waves, or holding fast to what they carry, and risking everything upon the mercy of the storm." A ripple of surprised murmurs moved around the table. Lord Sebastian's smile faltered slightly, clearly having expected either confident confirmation or nervous denial, not the calm, accurate summary Eliza had just delivered. "That is remarkably close to the passage's true meaning," he admitted, though his tone carried less triumph now and more genuine surprise. "I told you she had wit beyond what you expected, Sebastian," the Duke said, his voice carefully light, attempting to steer the conversation back toward safer waters. "Perhaps now we might return to more pleasant topics." But Lord Sebastian was not so easily satisfied. "Wit is one explanation," he said slowly, studying Eliza with new and uncomfortable intensity. "Though I confess, Miss Hartley, your understanding seems rather too precise for mere guesswork. Tell me honestly, where did a servant girl acquire such an education?" The room fell silent, every guest waiting for her answer, and Eliza understood, with sudden clarity, that the moment for careful half-truths had finally passed. "My father was a teacher, my lord," she said, lifting her chin slightly, her voice steady and clear enough to carry across the entire table. "He taught young gentlemen their letters and their languages, and he believed his own daughter deserved the same education he offered his students, regardless of what our circumstances might one day become. I have hidden this fact since arriving at Ashcombe Manor, not from shame, but because I understood how such knowledge might be received by those who believe education belongs only to certain families and not to others." Her words hung in the air, bold and unapologetic, and for a long moment, no one at the table seemed to know quite how to respond. The Duchess, who had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, studying the scene with careful, measuring eyes, finally spoke. "A daughter educated by her own father, in languages and letters," she said slowly, her tone difficult to read. "That is no small thing, Miss Hartley. Your father must have been a man of considerable conviction, to offer such an education to a daughter, knowing society would offer her little opportunity to use it." "He believed knowledge should never be wasted, Your Grace," Eliza replied, meeting the Duchess's sharp gaze directly, regardless of whether the world was ready to make use of it. Lord Sebastian, sensing the conversation had turned away from the humiliation he had intended and towards something closer to admiration, attempted one final thrust. "Regardless of her father's convictions, surely we can agree that such education, hidden as it was, raises questions about honesty within this household. A servant who conceals her true nature is a servant who cannot be fully trusted. Wouldn't you agree, Ashford?" The Duke's expression hardened, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight and authority Eliza had rarely heard from him before. "I would say, Sebastian, that a woman forced by circumstance to hide her intelligence in order to survive within a household that mocks such intelligence at every opportunity is not being dishonest. She is being wise. If anyone in this room has behaved dishonestly tonight, it is the man who prepared a trap for a servant simply to satisfy his own wounded pride." The table went utterly silent. Lord Sebastian's face flushed with anger and embarrassment, though he said nothing further, clearly recognizing that he had lost whatever advantage he believed he held only moments before. The Duchess studied her son, with an expression Eliza could not quite decipher, somewhere between surprise and quiet, reluctant approval. "Well," she said finally, breaking the tense silence that had settled over the table, "it seems this evening has proven far more interesting than I anticipated. Perhaps we might allow Miss Hartley to return to her duties and turn our conversation toward less contentious matters." The dinner continued after that, though the atmosphere remained charged with an unspoken tension that lingered long after the final course had been cleared. Eliza moved through the remainder of the evening in a daze, her mind struggling to process everything that had just occurred, the way a single moment can shift the entire shape of a life without warning. Later that night, once the guests had departed and the household had finally quieted, Eliza found herself once again in the library, though this time, she did not need to slip down quietly under cover of darkness. The Duke had sent word through Mrs. Dawson that he wished to speak with her, openly, without pretense of secrecy, for the first time since their strange friendship had begun. She found him standing near the window, his expression thoughtful, his usual composure replaced by something rawer and more uncertain. "You defended me tonight," she said softly, closing the door behind her, in front of everyone. "I told the truth," the Duke replied, turning to face her. "Something I have not always been especially skilled at, particularly where matters of pride and position are concerned." "Lord Sebastian will not forget this humiliation easily," Eliza said carefully. "Nor will your mother forget the attention it has drawn toward us both." "No," the Duke agreed. "He will not, and she will not either. But I find, standing here tonight, that I no longer wish to hide what has grown between us, simply to protect a reputation built upon cruelty and careless mockery." Eliza's breath caught at his words, understanding their weight even before he continued. "I do not yet know what path lies ahead for either of us," the Duke said quietly, taking a slow step closer. "But I know I do not wish to walk it, pretending you are simply a servant who serves my wine and dusts my shelves. You are, quite plainly, Miss Hartley, the most remarkable person I have encountered within these walls, and I find myself unwilling to continue hiding that truth any longer, whatever the consequences may be." Eliza stood quietly for a long moment, letting the Duke's words settle over her like warm light after a long winter. She had spent so many months guarding every part of herself, hiding her knowledge, hiding her grief, hiding even the small hopes that occasionally flickered to life within her chest, that she hardly knew how to respond to someone finally choosing to see her plainly, without pretense or careful distance. "I do not know what to say, Your Grace," she admitted softly. "You need not say anything tonight," the Duke replied gently. "I only wished for you to know the truth of my own thoughts, whatever you choose to do with that knowledge." Eliza nodded slowly, though her mind remained a swirl of uncertainty long after she returned to her narrow bed that night. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking of her father, of the quiet cottage where she had once believed her future held nothing but books and simple contentment, long before misfortune had rewritten every plan she had ever made for herself. She wondered what he would think of the strange path her life had taken, of a duke who had once mocked her openly at dinner, now standing before her, admitting feelings neither of them had expected to develop. She suspected he would tell her to guard her heart carefully, the same way he had once taught her to guard her knowledge, protecting it from those who might wish to use it against her. Meanwhile, in a townhouse across the county, Lord Sebastian Grey sat brooding over a glass of brandy, his humiliation from the previous evening still burning fresh in his memory. He was not a man accustomed to losing, particularly not to a servant girl in front of an audience of his peers, and the sting of that public embarrassment had settled into something far more dangerous than simple annoyance. Lady Beatrice Fenwick arrived at his townhouse the following afternoon, her expression sharp with the particular satisfaction of a woman who enjoys watching others struggle. "You look troubled, Sebastian," she said, settling into the chair across from him with practiced grace. "I confess I rather enjoyed watching Ashford's little display last evening, though I imagine it left you feeling rather less amused." "That maid humiliated me, in front of half of London society," Lord Sebastian said, his voice tight with barely restrained anger, "and Ashford defended her as though she were some visiting dignitary rather than a servant who dusts his shelves for wages." "Perhaps that is precisely what concerns you most," Lady Beatrice said, studying her fingernails with feigned indifference. "It is not merely embarrassment that troubles you, is it? It is the possibility that Ashford's affections have shifted toward someone entirely unsuitable, someone who threatens the natural order. Both of us have benefited from our entire lives." Lord Sebastian's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting, Beatrice?" "Only that perhaps it is time someone reminded the Duke of Ravensworth exactly what is at stake, should his strange fascination with his maid continue unchecked," she said smoothly. "A whispered word here, a carefully placed rumor there, and society itself will do the rest of our work for us. No man, however stubborn, can withstand the full weight of scandal for long, particularly not a man whose family has spent generations building a spotless reputation." Lord Sebastian considered her words carefully, a slow, calculating smile spreading across his face, for the first time since the previous evening's humiliation. "You always did understand the mechanics of society better than most, Beatrice. It is a skill worth cultivating," she replied, returning his smile with one equally calculating. "Shall we begin?" Over the following days, small rumors began to spread through the drawing rooms and dinner parties of London society, carried by careful whispers and knowing glances exchanged between guests who had never even set foot inside Ashcombe Manor. The stories grew with each retelling, exaggerated and distorted, until the simple truth of quiet conversations, shared in a library, had transformed into something far more scandalous in the minds of those eager for gossip. Word eventually reached the Duchess through one of her closest friends, who mentioned, with careful concern disguised as casual conversation, the growing talk surrounding her son's unusual attachment to a servant girl within his household. The Duchess listened with outward calm, though internally, her worry deepened considerably, beyond what she had already expressed to her son directly. She summoned Eliza to her private sitting room that same afternoon, a request that filled Eliza with immediate dread the moment Mrs. Dawson delivered the message. "You wish to see me, Your Grace?" Eliza asked, entering the room carefully, her hands folded before her in the practiced posture of a servant expecting difficult news. "Sit, Miss Hartley," the Duchess said, gesturing toward the chair across from her own, a gesture that surprised Eliza, given the formal distance the Duchess usually maintained between herself and the household staff. Eliza sat cautiously, uncertain what to expect. "I imagine you are aware of the rumors currently circulating through society," the Duchess began, her tone measured and careful. "Rumors concerning yourself and my son." "I have heard whispers among the other servants, Your Grace," Eliza admitted quietly, "though I confess, I did not realize how far the talk had already spread beyond this household. Considerably further than either of us would wish," the Duchess said. "Lord Sebastian and Lady Beatrice, I suspect, have taken considerable pleasure in ensuring the story reaches every drawing room in London before the week's end." Eliza's stomach twisted with anxiety. "What will happen, Your Grace?" The Duchess studied her for a long moment before answering, her sharp eyes softening slightly, though her concern remained evident. "That depends a great deal on what my son chooses to do next, and what you yourself are willing to endure, Miss Hartley. Scandal of this nature does not simply fade quietly. It grows teeth, and it bites hardest at those with the least power to defend themselves. You must understand, whatever affection may exist between yourself and my son, that society will not forgive easily, and the consequences for you will likely prove far harsher than anything Edmund himself will ever face." "I understand that, Your Grace," Eliza said softly. "I have understood it since the very beginning." "And yet you continued regardless," the Duchess observed, not unkindly. "I did," Eliza admitted, perhaps foolishly. The Duchess was quiet for a long moment, studying the young woman before her, with an expression Eliza could not quite decipher. "My husband once told me that foolishness and courage often wear the same face, Miss Hartley, and only time reveals which one a person has truly chosen. I do not yet know which face you wear. But I confess, after witnessing your composure last evening, I find myself less certain than I once was, that this situation is entirely the foolishness Lord Sebastian and Lady Beatrice would have society believe." Eliza felt a small flicker of hope at these words, though she remained cautious, unwilling to trust too quickly in what might simply be careful diplomacy from a woman skilled in navigating difficult conversations. "What would you have me do, Your Grace?" she asked finally. The Duchess rose slowly from her chair, moving toward the window, her expression thoughtful. "I would have you prepare yourself, Miss Hartley, for whatever comes next, because I suspect, whether through scandal or through my son's own stubborn convictions, this quiet arrangement of yours cannot remain hidden much longer. And when it finally comes fully into the light, both of you will need considerable strength to withstand what follows." Eliza left the Duchess's sitting room with her heart heavy and her mind racing, understanding now more clearly than ever before just how precarious her position had become. The quiet friendship she had built with the Duke, born from stolen moments in a candlelit library, had grown into something far larger than either of them had anticipated, and now the entire weight of society's judgment threatened to come crashing down upon them both. She did not yet know that Lord Sebastian and Lady Beatrice's whispered campaign had already reached its most dangerous stage, nor that a plan far more direct than simple gossip was already forming in their minds, one designed not merely to embarrass the Duke, but to remove Eliza from Ashcombe Manor entirely. Lord Sebastian's plan took shape over the course of a single evening, born from equal parts wounded pride and calculated cruelty. He understood that rumors alone might not prove sufficient to drive a wedge between the Duke and his maid, particularly given how firmly Ashford had defended her during the previous dinner party. Something more direct would be required, something that could not be so easily dismissed or defended against. He found his opportunity through a conversation with one of the household's younger servants, a footman named Charlie who had grown resentful after being passed over for a promotion Eliza had unknowingly received consideration for instead. Lord Sebastian offered the young man a generous sum of money in exchange for a small, simple task: to plant a piece of the Duke's personal correspondence, a private letter of some sentimental value, among Eliza's belongings, where it could later be discovered and used as proof of theft. The footman, torn between guilt and the temptation of easy money, ultimately accepted the arrangement, telling himself the harm would be minimal, that Eliza would simply be questioned, and the letter quietly returned once suspicions were raised. He did not fully understand, or perhaps did not wish to understand, the full scope of what Lord Sebastian intended. The plan unfolded 3 days later, during a quiet afternoon when the Duke had gathered several guests, including Lord Sebastian and Lady Beatrice, for a small luncheon in the manor's garden. Partway through the meal, the Duke excused himself briefly to retrieve a particular book he wished to share with his guests, only to discover, moments later, that a treasured letter from his late father, kept safely locked within his private desk, had gone missing entirely. The household was thrown into immediate confusion as servants were questioned one by one. Lord Sebastian, feigning helpful concern, suggested quietly that perhaps a search of the servants' quarters might resolve the matter quickly, a suggestion the Duke, distracted and troubled by the loss of something so personally meaningful, agreed to reluctantly. The letter was discovered within the hour, tucked carefully inside Eliza's small trunk, hidden beneath the folded scarf that had once wrapped her father's book of Latin poems. Eliza stood frozen with shock and confusion as Mrs. Dawson held up the letter before the assembled household, her expression a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. "Eliza Hartley," the housekeeper said, her voice heavy with reluctant duty, "you will need to explain yourself immediately." "I do not understand," Eliza said, her voice trembling, despite her attempt to remain calm. "I have never seen that letter before in my life. I would never take something belonging to His Grace." But her protests, however sincere, carried little weight against the physical evidence now displayed before the entire household. Whispers spread quickly among the servants, some sympathetic, others already convinced of her guilt, uncertain whom to believe given the strange rumors that had already circulated regarding her unusual relationship with the Duke. Word reached the garden luncheon within minutes, and the Duke arrived at the servants' quarters with visible alarm, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to something closer to devastation, as he saw the letter held in Mrs. Dawson's hands. "Where was this found?" he demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "In Miss Hartley's trunk, Your Grace," Mrs. Dawson answered carefully, clearly uncomfortable delivering such news. The Duke turned toward Eliza, and for a terrible, aching moment, she saw something in his expression she had never expected to see directed toward her: doubt. "Eliza," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time in front of witnesses, his voice strained with confusion and hurt. "Tell me you did not do this." "I did not, Your Grace," Eliza said firmly, meeting his gaze despite the tears now threatening to spill from her eyes. "I swear to you, upon my father's memory, I have never touched that letter. I do not know how it came to be among my belongings." The Duke studied her face carefully, searching for some sign of deception, though everything in her expression spoke only of genuine confusion and hurt. Behind him, Lord Sebastian and Lady Beatrice had arrived from the garden, drawn by the commotion, their expressions carefully arranged into masks of polite concern that barely concealed the satisfaction hiding just beneath the surface. "Perhaps this proves what many have suspected all along," Lord Sebastian said smoothly, addressing the small crowd of servants and guests that had gathered. "A servant elevated beyond her station, given liberties she was never meant to receive, eventually reaches beyond what is rightfully hers to claim. It is an unfortunate lesson, Ashford, but perhaps a necessary one." The Duke's jaw tightened at these words, though his eyes remained fixed on Eliza, searching for the truth even as circumstantial evidence mounted heavily against her. "I did not steal from you," Eliza repeated, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt building throughout her entire body. "I understand how this appears, Your Grace, but I swear upon everything I hold sacred that I am innocent of this accusation." For a long, agonizing moment, the Duke said nothing, caught between the physical evidence before him and the deep trust that had grown between himself and Eliza over the past several weeks. Around them, the assembled crowd waited in tense silence, uncertain how this moment would resolve, understanding instinctively that whatever the Duke decided next would carry consequences far beyond the simple matter of a missing letter. Finally, the Duke turned toward Mrs. Dawson. "Has anyone else had access to Miss Hartley's quarters recently?" "Only the other servants who share the floor, Your Grace," Mrs. Dawson replied carefully, though I could not say with certainty who might have entered without notice. The Duke's gaze shifted slowly toward Lord Sebastian, a flicker of suspicion beginning to form behind his eyes, though he had no proof yet to support such a thought. "This letter was locked within my private desk only yesterday morning," he said slowly. "I checked it myself before breakfast. Very few people within this household, or among my guests, would have known its exact location, let alone had opportunity to remove it and transport it to the servants' quarters without detection." Lord Sebastian's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, though he recovered quickly, maintaining his careful mask of innocent concern. "Surely you do not suspect one of your own guests, Ashford. That would be a serious accusation indeed." "I suspect nothing yet," the Duke replied evenly, though his tone carried a new, careful edge that had not been present moments before. "But I intend to discover the truth of this matter fully, before passing judgment on anyone, servant or guest alike." He turned back toward Eliza, and something in his expression softened slightly, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily upon them both. "You will not be dismissed from this household, Miss Hartley, not until I have satisfied myself completely regarding what truly occurred here today. But I must ask that you remain within the manor while this matter is properly investigated." Eliza nodded, relief mixing uncomfortably with the lingering sting of having seen doubt cross his face, however briefly, however quickly it had passed. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said quietly. As the crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring among themselves about the strange turn of events, Eliza caught sight of Charlie, the young footman, standing pale and uncertain near the edge of the gathering, his eyes darting nervously between Lord Sebastian and the letter still held in Mrs. Dawson's hands. Something in his expression, guilty and afraid, caught her attention, though she said nothing, filing the observation away carefully for later consideration. That evening, once the household had finally quieted and the guests had departed, the Duke summoned Eliza to his private study, a room she had never before entered, separate from the shared warmth of the library where their friendship had grown over the preceding weeks. "I owe you an apology," he said, the moment she entered, his expression heavy with genuine remorse. "For the doubt you saw in my face today, however briefly it lasted. I should have trusted you immediately, without hesitation." "The evidence was difficult to ignore, Your Grace," Eliza said gently. "I do not fault you for questioning it. Regardless, I intend to discover exactly who arranged this deception against you," the Duke said, his voice firm with quiet determination. "And when I do, they will answer fully for the harm they have attempted to cause." Eliza studied his face carefully, seeing there a resolve she had not fully witnessed before. A willingness to fight, not simply for his own reputation, but for hers as well, regardless of what such a fight might ultimately cost him among his peers. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said softly, "for believing me, in the end." "I should never have doubted you at all," the Duke replied, "and I do not intend to make that mistake again." Neither of them yet knew how quickly the truth would surface, nor how dramatically the coming revelation would finally force the Duke to choose, publicly and irrevocably, between the world he had always known and the woman who had quietly, unexpectedly, become the truest friend he had ever known within it. The Duke spent the following 2 days quietly gathering information, questioning members of the household with careful patience rather than open accusation, understanding that whoever had arranged the deception against Eliza would grow careless only if they believed themselves safely undetected. He began with the servants who occupied the same floor as Eliza's quarters, asking simple questions about their movements over the past week, watching closely for any sign of nervousness or hesitation in their answers. Most of the servants answered easily enough, their stories consistent with the ordinary routines of household life. But when the Duke finally spoke privately with Charlie, the young footman's discomfort proved impossible to fully hide, despite his obvious attempts to appear calm. "You seem troubled, Charlie," the Duke observed carefully, watching the young man's hands twist nervously at his sides. "Is there something you wish to tell me?" "No, Your Grace," Charlie said quickly, though his voice wavered slightly. "I know nothing of the missing letter, nor how it came to be found among Miss Hartley's belongings. I did not ask about the letter specifically, the Duke replied evenly, watching the young man's expression carefully. I asked only whether something troubles you. Charlie's composure cracked slightly at these words, guilt clearly warring with fear within his expression. Your Grace, He stopped himself abruptly, clearly torn between confession and continued denial. Whatever you have done, the Duke said gently, softening his tone, the consequences will be far less severe if you speak honestly now, rather than allowing an innocent woman to suffer for a deception you did not fully intend to cause. The young footman's shoulders sagged, and after a long, tense moment, the truth finally spilled from him in a rush of guilty confession. It was Lord Sebastian, Your Grace. He offered me money, a considerable sum, to place the letter among Miss Hartley's belongings. He told me it would only be discovered and returned, that no real harm would come of it. I did not understand, until I saw her standing there, accused before the whole household, exactly how serious the consequences would become. I am deeply sorry, Your Grace. I never intended for her to suffer such humiliation. The Duke listened with a mixture of quiet fury and grim satisfaction, finally possessing the confirmation he had suspected but could not yet prove. You will write out your confession in full, Charlie, and you will sign it. Your position within this household is forfeit, but I will not pursue further punishment beyond your dismissal, given your honesty now and coming forward. Thank you, Your Grace, Charlie said, visible relief flooding through his exhausted expression. I truly am sorry. Armed with the young footman's written confession, the Duke made his decision quickly. He would not simply confront Lord Sebastian privately, allowing the matter to be quietly dismissed or explained away among close friends. He intended to expose the full truth publicly, in front of the very same audience that had witnessed Eliza's humiliation, ensuring that whatever damage had been done to her reputation would be equally and publicly undone. He arranged a small gathering 3 days later, inviting many of the same guests who had witnessed the earlier accusation, including Lord Sebastian and Lady Beatrice, under the pretense of a simple evening of cards and conversation. Eliza, though nervous about what the evening might hold, agreed to be present at the Duke's request, understanding that whatever unfolded would finally determine the shape of her future within Ashcombe Manor, and perhaps beyond it as well. The evening began ordinarily enough, guests exchanging pleasant conversation over drinks and light refreshments. But partway through the gathering, the Duke rose from his seat, drawing the attention of the entire room with practiced authority. Before we continue this evening's entertainment, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the drawing room, I have a matter of some importance to address, one that concerns every person currently present. The room quieted immediately, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Lord Sebastian's expression flickered with sudden unease, though he quickly composed himself, unwilling to appear anything other than confident before the assembled guests. Several days ago, the Duke continued, a valuable letter belonging to my late father was discovered among the belongings of my maid, Miss Eliza Hartley. Many of you witnessed her accusation, and I imagine many of you formed conclusions regarding her character based upon that unfortunate evidence. Eliza stood quietly near the edge of the room, her heart pounding as every eye turned toward her once again, though this time the Duke's steady presence beside her offered a comfort the previous incident had lacked. I have since discovered the true circumstances surrounding that letter's placement, the Duke continued, withdrawing a folded paper from his coat, the young footman's signed confession held firmly in his hand. Miss Hartley did not steal that letter. She was deliberately, maliciously framed by someone within this very room, someone who paid a member of my household staff to plant the evidence against her, purely out of wounded pride and petty resentment. Gasps of surprise rippled through the assembled guests. Lord Sebastian's face had gone pale, though he attempted, with visibly failing composure, to maintain his usual confident demeanor. This is a serious accusation, Ashford. I hope you do not intend to suggest. I do not merely suggest, Sebastian, the Duke interrupted, his voice cold and controlled, despite the evident anger simmering beneath his words. I have a signed confession from the footman you paid to carry out this deception. Charlie has admitted everything, including the exact sum you offered him, and the precise instructions you provided regarding where and how to place the letter. The room fell into stunned silence. Lady Beatrice's fan had stopped mid-wave, her expression frozen in careful blankness, though her eyes darted nervously toward the door, as though searching for some means of escape from the mounting tension. "You would take the word of a dismissed servant over that of a gentleman," Lord Sebastian said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence, cracking slightly under the weight of the room's collective attention. "I would take the word of honest confession over the word of a man who has spent weeks spreading cruel rumors and orchestrating elaborate schemes, simply because a servant girl proved cleverer than he expected, and because I dared to treat her with the respect any person deserves, regardless of their station," the Duke replied, his voice steady and unwavering. "Miss Hartley is innocent of every accusation brought against her, both the theft you engineered and the impropriety you and others have whispered about behind closed doors. I will not stand by silently while her character is destroyed, simply because certain members of society cannot accept that intelligence and worth are not determined by birth alone." The assembled guests shifted uncomfortably, many exchanging glances of quiet embarrassment, understanding now how thoroughly they had been misled by rumor and careless assumption. A few offered quiet murmurs of apology, directed toward Eliza, though most remained silent, uncertain how to respond to such a dramatic and public reversal. Lord Sebastian, recognizing the complete collapse of his scheme before the very audience he had hoped to use against Eliza, rose stiffly from his chair. "I believe I have overstayed my welcome this evening," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled humiliation. "I believe you have overstayed your welcome within this household entirely," the Duke replied evenly. "You will not be received at Ashcombe Manor again, Sebastian, nor will I speak favorably of your character to anyone who asks my opinion of you going forward." Lord Sebastian said nothing further, simply gathering what remained of his dignity and departing the room swiftly, Lady Beatrice following closely behind him, her earlier confidence utterly shattered. Once they had gone, the Duke turned toward the remaining guests, his expression softening slightly, though his voice retained its earlier firmness. "I hope this evening has clarified matters sufficiently for everyone present. Miss Hartley's character and integrity remain entirely intact, and I trust that whatever rumors have circulated regarding her will now be properly corrected among your acquaintances." The guests murmured their agreement, several approaching Eliza directly to offer sincere apologies for having believed the earlier rumors, their earlier suspicion replaced now with genuine respect for the quiet dignity she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Eliza stood amid the shifting crowd, her emotions a complicated tangle of relief, vindication, and lingering disbelief at how dramatically the evening had unfolded. She caught the Duke's eye across the room, and in his expression, she saw not simply relief that justice had been served, but something deeper, something that told her clearly the path ahead, whatever it held, would no longer require the careful hiding and quiet secrecy that had defined their friendship until this very moment. In the weeks that followed, life at Ashcombe Manor settled into a new and unfamiliar rhythm, one shaped by the public reckoning that had finally exposed the truth of Lord Sebastian's cruelty and vindicated Eliza's character before all who had once doubted her. The rumors that had once spread so quickly through London's drawing rooms now carried a different story entirely, one of a scheming nobleman exposed, and a servant girl whose quiet dignity had ultimately triumphed over petty cruelty and careless gossip. The Duchess, though still cautious by nature, found herself softening considerably toward Eliza in the days following the confrontation. She summoned the young woman once more to her private sitting room, though this time the conversation carried none of the earlier tension that had marked their first meeting. "You handled yourself remarkably well throughout this entire ordeal, Miss Hartley," the Duchess said, studying Eliza with an expression that held genuine warmth for the first time since their acquaintance began. Few people, servant or noble alike, could have maintained such composure under circumstances designed specifically to break it. "Thank you, Your Grace," Eliza replied, "though I confess, there were moments I feared I might not manage it at all." "Fear rarely disappears, simply because courage is present," the Duchess said thoughtfully. "The two often exist together, Miss Hartley, and it is what a person does, despite that fear, which truly reveals their character." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "I have spoken with my son regarding his intentions toward you. He tells me he wishes for you to remain at Ashcombe Manor, though not simply in your current position." Eliza's heart quickened slightly at these words, uncertain what the Duchess intended by them. "What has he proposed, Your Grace?" "He wishes to establish you as a companion, and tutor to the younger children of our extended family, a position that would allow your education to be properly utilized, rather than hidden away beneath a maid's uniform," the Duchess explained. "It is not, perhaps, the full recognition your talents deserve, given the strict boundaries our society still maintains, but it is considerably more than what you currently hold, and it would allow you to remain within this household with dignity, rather than secrecy." Eliza felt tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in her circumstances after so many months of careful hiding and quiet endurance. "I do not know how to properly express my gratitude, Your Grace." "Do not thank me yet," the Duchess said, though her tone had softened considerably from its earlier sharpness. "I confess, I have my own reservations regarding what may eventually develop between yourself and my son, given how thoroughly he has come to admire you. Society will not easily accept such a match, should it ever come to that, regardless of your remarkable qualities. But I find, having watched you these past weeks, that I no longer believe caution alone should determine every decision within this family. My son has shown more genuine character defending you publicly than I have witnessed from him in years of careful, proper behavior. Perhaps that is worth more than society's approval, in the end." Eliza left the Duchess's sitting room that afternoon, with her mind and heart full to overflowing, understanding that whatever path lay ahead, she no longer needed to walk it entirely alone, hidden behind careful masks and quiet secrecy. That evening, she found the Duke waiting for her in the library, as he so often did, though this time he did not sit near the fire with a book left deliberately unread. Instead, he stood near the window, watching the last light of evening fade slowly over the gardens below. "My mother has spoken with you," he said, turning as she entered. "She has, Your Grace," Eliza replied, closing the door softly behind her. "She tells me you wish to establish me as a tutor for the younger children in your family." "I do," the Duke confirmed, "though I confess that position is only the beginning of what I hope for our future, if you are willing to consider it." Eliza felt her breath catch slightly at the quiet sincerity in his voice. "What do you hope for, Your Grace?" The Duke crossed the room slowly, stopping before her with an expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever witnessed from him before. "I have spent my entire life believing that distance and careful propriety were the only paths toward a life of dignity and respect. My father taught me that lesson early, and I carried it faithfully for years, never once questioning whether it served me well or simply kept me isolated from the very things that might have brought genuine happiness into my life." He paused, gathering his thoughts carefully before continuing. "You have shown me, Eliza, in these past months, exactly how mistaken that lesson truly was. You have shown me honesty where I expected only careful performance, courage where I expected only quiet submission, and a depth of character I have found nowhere else within the whole of London society, despite years spent among its most celebrated families." Eliza's eyes filled with tears once more, though these carried none of the earlier fear or uncertainty, only the quiet, overwhelming relief of finally being truly seen and valued for exactly who she was. "I do not know what our future holds," the Duke continued, taking her hands gently in his own. "Society may never fully accept what has grown between us, and the road ahead may prove difficult, in ways neither of us can yet predict. But I find, having witnessed your strength these past weeks, that I no longer wish to walk any path that does not include you standing beside me, as an equal in every way that truly matters, whatever titles or positions society chooses to assign us." "Nor do I, Your Grace," Eliza said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion coursing through her. "I have spent so long hiding who I truly am, believing that survival required silence and careful invisibility. You have shown me that survival need not come at the cost of everything my father worked so hard to give me." The Duke smiled then, a genuine, unguarded smile unlike any Eliza had seen from him before their friendship began. "Then let us discover this new path together, Eliza Hartley, whatever challenges it may bring." In the months that followed, Eliza settled comfortably into her new position within the household, teaching the younger children of the extended Ashford family with the same patient dedication her own father had once shown her. Word of her remarkable education spread gradually through more sympathetic corners of society, and though whispers of scandal never entirely disappeared, they grew steadily quieter as more people came to witness firsthand the genuine respect and warmth that had grown between the Duke and the woman he had once mocked so carelessly at his own dinner table. Lord Sebastian and Lady Beatrice found themselves increasingly excluded from the finer circles of society, their reputations tarnished by the very scheme they had hoped would destroy someone else entirely. Justice, it seemed, had a way of finding its proper balance, even within a world so often ruled by careless privilege and casual cruelty. As for Eliza and the Duke, their friendship deepened steadily into something neither of them had expected to find within the walls of Ashcombe Manor, a partnership built not upon the shallow foundations of title or wealth, but upon genuine respect, honest conversation, and the quiet, unshakable courage of a young woman who had once corrected a duke's careless Latin, and in doing so, changed the course of both their lives entirely. The manor's grand library, once merely a symbol of wealth, rarely used for its true purpose, became instead a place of genuine learning and connection, its shelves finally read rather than simply admired, its quiet corners filled once more with the sound of honest conversation between two people who had learned, against every expectation society had placed upon them, that true worth was never determined by the uniform a person wore, but by the depth of character hidden quietly beneath it.